The dust of our family farm had a way of getting into everything. It settled in the lines of my hands, a fine, reddish-brown powder that soap and water never quite scrubbed away. It clung to the hems of my jeans, perfumed my hair, and coated the back of my throat. When I had lived in Chicago, I'd spent a small fortune on lotions and air purifiers to erase any trace of the country. Now, back in the heart of rural Ohio, that same dust felt like the only tangible thing my parents had left me. It had been 6 months since the joint funeral, a cruel, efficient ceremony that had packaged up a lifetime of love and laughter and buried it under a neat square of sod in the local churchyard. A single patch of black ice on a winter road had stolen both of them, leaving me, their only child, the sole heir to Miller Family Farms. 150 acres of tired cornfields, a sagging barn, and a farmhouse that creaked like an old man's bones. Giving up my marketing job in the city hadn't been a choice so much as a reflex. The farm was failing. Dad had been too proud and Mom too optimistic to tell me how bad it had gotten. After they were gone, the letters started arriving. Unopened bills were piled on the kitchen table like a monument to their quiet struggle. Foreclosure notices with bold red lettering screamed from the clutter. The farm wasn't just losing money, it was a lead weight pulling me under. My city life, with its glass-walled office, its overpriced lattes, and its carefully curated friendships, felt like a movie I'd once watched. Chloe Miller, the sharp, ambitious marketing strategist, had been replaced by Chloe Miller, the grieving daughter in muddy boots, trying to decipher crop rotation charts and figure out how to fix a leaking roof with a bucket and a prayer. Today, the dread was a physical presence, a tightness in my chest that the humid July air did nothing to ease. It was the day of the family reunion, a term my Uncle Robert used with the same casual authority he used for a hostile takeover. He wasn't coming to mourn or to help. He was coming to circle like a vulture. The screen door slammed behind me as I stepped onto the porch, a chipped mug of coffee in my hand. The sun was just beginning to burn through the morning haze, casting a golden light on the fields. Dew clung to the spiderwebs woven between the porch railings. For a moment, it was beautiful, the kind of quiet, simple beauty that had driven me crazy as a teenager, and that I'd found myself desperately missing in the concrete canyons of the city. My father's voice echoed in my memory, a low, steady rumble from 1,000 different moments on this very porch. "This land, Chloe, it's not just dirt. It's our story. It's your story. Don't you ever let anyone take it from you." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. He'd made it sound so simple, so noble. He hadn't mentioned the soul-crushing debt, the broken-down tractor, or the predatory loans that his own brother had so generously helped him secure. A flash of silver on the horizon signaled their arrival. Uncle Robert's new Mercedes, a car that cost more than our entire farm was supposedly worth, was making its way down our long gravel driveway. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, a spaceship landing in a forgotten world. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and impending conflict. I could already hear my Aunt Brenda's thinly veiled insults about the rustic charm, and see the bored, dismissive looks on my cousins' faces. They weren't family coming to visit. They were shareholders coming to liquidate a failed asset. And that asset was me. The Mercedes crunched to a halt, its pristine silver finish already coated in a fine layer of our farm's signature dust. I watched from the porch, my coffee now cold, as the doors opened. Uncle Robert emerged first, looking crisp and uncomfortable in a pastel polo shirt and slacks that were far too expensive for a place where cow manure was a constant hazard. He was my father's older brother, but they'd been cut from different cloths. Where Dad was oak, sturdy and weathered, Robert was steel and glass, polished and cold. "Chloe, sweetheart," he called out, his voice booming with a manufactured warmth that never reached his eyes. He spread his arms for a hug I had no intention of returning with any real affection. His wife, my Aunt Brenda, slid out of the passenger side, her face a mask of polite distaste as her heels sank slightly into the gravel. Her designer sunglasses were so large they hid half her face, but I knew her expression underneath them. It was the same one she wore whenever she was forced to venture outside her gated community. a mixture of pity and revulsion. Then came my cousins, Josh and Tiffany. Josh, 22 and already a junior partner in his father's real estate firm, was busy tapping on his phone, likely closing a deal or swiping through a dating app. Tiffany, a year younger, was filming her arrival in the boonies for her social media followers, panning her phone across the peeling paint of the barn with a sarcastic pout. "Oh, darling, it's so authentic," Brenda said as she approached the porch steps, carefully avoiding a patch of mud. The word hung in the air, a perfectly crafted insult disguised as a compliment. I forced a tight smile. "It's a farm, Aunt Brenda. It's supposed to be." Robert clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt more like an appraisal. "You're looking thin, kiddo. City stress finally catching up? Or is it this whole situation?" He waved a hand, encompassing the entire farm, my entire life, in a single dismissive gesture. "I'm managing," I said, my voice flatter than I intended. The four of them trooped into the house, their city energy instantly sucking the quiet peace from the rooms. Brenda ran a finger along the wooden mantelpiece and then subtly inspected it for dust. Josh immediately asked for the Wi-Fi password, his face falling when I told him it was slow and unreliable. Tiffany sighed dramatically, complaining about the lack of cell service. "How do you live like this?" she asked. Not to me, but to her phone screen as she struggled to upload her video. "It's like pioneer times." I spent the next hour playing the part of the gracious host, pouring iced tea and setting out the sad-looking platter of store-bought cookies I'd picked up in town. They talked about their recent trip to Tuscany, about Josh's new boat, about the charity gala Brenda was chairing. Their lives were a series of acquisitions and events, while mine had become a cycle of chores and worries. They spoke a language of wealth and ease that felt foreign and abrasive in the house, where my parents had counted every penny. Robert finally steered the conversation where he'd intended it to go all along. He sat at the head of the heavy oak table my great-grandfather had built, in the very chair that had always been my father's. "Listen, Chloe," he began, leaning forward with a conspiratorial air. "We need to have a serious talk about your future. About this place." Brenda nodded solemnly. "We're worried about you, dear. All alone out here. It's not healthy." "I'm not alone," I said, my grip tightening on my glass of iced tea. "I'm home." Robert sighed, a theatrical display of paternal patience. "Your father was a good man, but he was sentimental. He held on to this land long after it made any financial sense. You're smarter than that. You have a business mind." The compliment felt like a trap. He was trying to appeal to the Chicago Chloe, the one who understood spreadsheets and bottom lines, hoping she would overrule the grieving daughter. "I've been talking to a few people on your behalf," he continued, his voice dropping to a low, serious tone. "There's a developer, a good man, a friend of mine. He's interested in this whole parcel. He's willing to make a very generous offer to help you out of this bind." He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. It was an unofficial offer, typed up on his company's letterhead. I didn't have to look at the number to know it would be just enough to sound tempting, enough to pay off the debts and leave me with a small nest egg to start over. It would also be a fraction of what the land was truly worth to any developer. "He's willing to pay off all the farm's debts and give you a check for $200,000, free and clear," Robert said, leaning back as if he'd just handed me a winning lottery ticket. "You can walk away from this whole mess, Chloe. Go back to the city. Get your life back." I stared at the paper, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in my chest. He made it sound so easy, a clean break, an escape, but it felt like a betrayal. He wasn't just offering to buy the land. He was offering to buy my father's story, to erase it, and to profit from my grief. The vultures had stopped circling. They had landed, and they were ready to feast. The kitchen grew silent, the air thick with the unspoken weight of Robert's proposal. The number on the page, $200,000, seemed to mock me. To a city person, it might sound like a windfall, but I knew what it represented. It was the price of my heritage, the buyout for my parents' entire life's work, and it was a lowball offer, designed to prey on my desperation. 150 acres, even of tired farmland, was worth more. That's very generous of him, I managed to say, the words tasting like ash. Brenda placed a manicured hand on my arm. Her touch was cold. It's more than generous, darling. It's a lifeline. Robert worked very hard to get you that offer. Mr. Thompson, the developer, he doesn't usually bother with such small parcels, but your uncle convinced him, as a favor. A favor? The word twisted in my gut. Every favor from Robert came with strings attached, usually woven into a noose. Josh, who had been silent until now, finally looked up from his phone. Honestly, Chloe, you should take it and run. You could put a down payment on a decent condo with that. Get back to civilization. What are you even doing out here? Playing farmer? It's kind of pathetic. The cruelty of his words was so casual, so effortless, that it stole my breath. Tiffany chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. He's right. Like, this whole farm-to-table thing is cute on Instagram, but this is just dirt and sad old buildings. You could be brunching in the West Loop right now. Each word was a small, sharp jab, methodically breaking down my resolve. They saw my grief as a temporary, inconvenient phase. They saw my life here not as an act of love and duty, but as a failure. The Chicago Chloe, they remembered, wouldn't be caught dead in muddy boots, worrying about crop yields. My father loved this land, I said, my voice quiet but firm. He asked me to take care of it. Robert let out another one of his patient, weary sighs. Your father also left you with a mountain of debt, Chloe. Love doesn't pay the bank. Love doesn't fix that rust bucket tractor in the barn. I'm being practical here. I'm trying to save you from the mistake he made, clinging to the past. He leaned in again, his voice a low, persuasive hum. Think about it. No more bills you can't pay. No more waking up at dawn to do back-breaking work for nothing. You can go back to your real life. This isn't you, Chloe. You're a sharp, modern woman. You don't belong in a place that's stuck in the last century. His words were a potent poison, mixing with my own doubts and fears. He was right about the debt. He was right about the grueling work. Every morning, I woke up with a knot of anxiety in my stomach, wondering which new problem the day would bring. The thought of a clean slate, of money in the bank, and a life free from this constant crushing pressure was a siren's call. Who is this developer, Mr. Thompson? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. What does he want to do with the land? Robert waved a dismissive hand. Oh, some light commercial, maybe a few residential plots. Good for the local economy. Light commercial brings in jobs. He's a good man. I've done business with him for years. He was being intentionally vague. Light commercial could mean anything from a strip mall to a distribution warehouse. He was selling a dream of progress, a way to paint over our family's history with concrete and asphalt. Brenda stood and began clearing the table, a gesture meant to signal that the discussion was over, that a decision had been made. We'll give you some time to think it over, dear, she said brightly. But don't take too long. Mr. Thompson's offer won't stand forever. He's a busy man. They were cornering me, manufacturing a deadline to force my hand. I felt the walls of the old farmhouse closing in. My own home, the place I had come to for solace, had been turned into a boardroom where my life was being negotiated. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping against the worn wooden floor. I need some air, I mumbled, and without another word, I walked out the back door, letting the screen door slam shut behind me. The sound echoed the turmoil in my heart. Outside, the familiar landscape of my childhood seemed alien, its value being debated and dismissed by people who couldn't tell the difference between a soybean and a weed. My father had asked me to protect this place, but maybe, I thought with a terrifying wave of despair, the most practical way to protect myself was to let it go. The late afternoon sun was hot on my shoulders as I walked the property line, following the path my father's boots had worn into the earth over decades. This was his ritual. Every evening, he'd walk the perimeter, his silent communion with the land. He'd check the fences, watch the way the corn grew, and simply be present. I had always thought it was just a habit, but now I understood. It was an act of ownership, of love. My feet carried me to the highest point on the farm, a small grassy knoll overlooking the entire valley. From here, you could see everything: the patchwork of our fields, the glint of the creek in the distance, the roof of the farmhouse nestled in a grove of ancient oaks. It was a humble kingdom, but it was ours. I sank to the ground, the dry grass crunching beneath me. Robert's offer lay heavy in my pocket. $200,000. The number felt both enormous and insulting. It was enough to erase the red ink from my life, to give me a fresh start. But what would that start look like? A condo in a city I no longer felt connected to? A job creating ad campaigns for products no one needed? The life I'd run away from now felt hollow, a poor substitute for the raw, difficult, but meaningful existence I was living. Tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed in front of my relatives began to fall, hot and fast, tracing paths through the dust on my cheeks. I was so tired. Tired of fighting, tired of worrying, tired of being alone. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a sentimental fool, clinging to a ghost. My father had been a quiet man, not one for grand speeches, but his lessons were embedded in the land itself. I remembered one summer when I was a teenager, complaining endlessly about having to help him mend a fence. "Why do we bother?" I'd whined, my hands raw from the wire. "This fence is ancient. We should just get a new one." He had stopped his work and looked at me, his gaze steady. "This fence was built by your grandfather, Chloe, with wood from this land. Every post has a story. You don't throw away a story just because it's old. You respect it. You mend it." Now, his words felt like a direct command from the past. Was I about to throw away our entire family's story for the price of a condo? The developer, Thompson. The name rang a faint bell, but I couldn't place it. Robert said they were old business partners. That alone should have been a red flag. My uncle didn't have partners, he had pawns. He was a master of the long game, of acquiring assets through leverage and deception. He was a master. Why was he so invested in helping me? The Family Concern Act was thin. There had to be something more to it. I pulled out my phone. The signal was weak, just one bar, but it was enough. I typed Thompson Development, Ohio, into the search bar. The results were mostly corporate fluff, press releases about new shopping centers and housing developments. But then I added a new term: land acquisition. A few articles popped up from regional business journals. Thompson Development was known for its aggressive expansion, but one piece caught my eye. It detailed a controversial project a few counties over where they had bought up dozens of small family farms under the guise of a modest residential project. They'd paid just over market value for agricultural land. But months later, it was revealed that the company had conducted secret geological surveys and knew the area was sitting on a massive shale deposit, perfect for natural gas extraction. The land they bought for millions was, in fact, worth hundreds of millions. The farmers had been swindled. My blood ran cold. It couldn't be a coincidence. My father, he'd been so stubborn about this place in his final years. He'd refused every offer, even when the money could have eased their lives considerably. Everyone, including me, had called him sentimental. But what if it wasn't sentiment? What if it was knowledge? I remembered him taking strange meetings with men in suits, meetings he'd always been vague about. "Just business, Chloe. Soil surveys," he'd say, waving off my questions. I'd assumed it was related to farming, to crop yields, but the men hadn't looked like agriculturalists. They'd looked like engineers. A new energy surged through me, a fierce, protective anger that burned away the despair. Robert wasn't trying to help me. He was trying to use me. He was trying to finish a swindle he'd likely been planning for years. He thought I was just a grieving, naive city girl who would crumble under pressure. He had underestimated me, and he had underestimated my father. I stood up, wiping the tears from my face with the back of my dusty hand. My decision was made. I wasn't just going to say no. I was going to find out the truth. And I was going to make my uncle regret the day he ever set foot on my land. I walked back to the farmhouse with a new sense of purpose. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The beauty of it no longer felt mocking, it felt like a promise. When I entered the kitchen, the atmosphere was thick with impatience. Robert was on the phone, pacing by the window, his voice a low, angry murmur. Brenda was scrolling through a magazine, her lips pursed in a tight line. Josh and Tiffany were slumped on the living room couch, radiating teenage boredom. "Ah, she's back," Robert said, ending his call abruptly. "Have you come to your senses, Chloe?" I looked him straight in the eye, my newfound resolve hardening my gaze. "I'm not selling." A flicker of something, annoyance, anger, crossed his face before he masked it with his usual condescending smile. "Don't be emotional. We're talking about your future here." "I know what I'm talking about," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The answer is no. You can tell your friend Mr. Thompson the offer is rejected." Brenda gasped theatrically. "After all the trouble Robert went to for you? The ingratitude!" Before Robert could launch into his next calculated argument, a pair of headlights swept across the kitchen window, followed by the sound of another car crunching up the gravel driveway. This vehicle sounded different from Robert's luxury sedan. It was older, with a rumbling, dependable engine. A look of confusion passed between Robert and Brenda. They weren't expecting anyone else. I wasn't either. I walked to the front door and peered through the screen. A dusty, dark green Buick that had seen better days was parked behind the Mercedes. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a slightly rumpled suit stepped out. He was older, perhaps in his late 60s, with a kind, weathered face and a shock of white hair. He moved with a slow, deliberate pace, carrying an old leather briefcase. It was Mr. Harrison, my parents' lawyer. I hadn't seen him since the funeral, where he'd offered his sincere, quiet condolences. "Mr. Harrison?" I said, pushing the screen door open. "What are you doing here?" He gave me a gentle, paternal smile. "Evening, Chloe. I apologize for the late hour. I was in the area and thought it was high time we had a proper chat about your parents' estate. There are a few things your father wanted me to discuss with you personally when the time was right." Robert appeared behind me, his posture stiff and defensive. Everything was settled. The will was read. The farm and its debts passed to Chloe. It's all quite straightforward. Mr. Harrison's eyes flickered toward Robert, and his friendly demeanor cooled by a few degrees. "Robert, I wasn't aware there was a family meeting." His tone was polite, but there was an undercurrent of steel. "Actually, it's good you're here. This might concern you as well." We all moved into the living room. The air was electric with tension. My cousins looked up from their phones, a flicker of interest on their faces for the first time all day. Mr. Harrison set his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with a decisive snap of the latches. "Your father, Chloe," he began, looking directly at me, "was a very methodical, and as it turns out, very private man. The will we read after the funeral was his official public document. It covered the basics. However, your father also established a private trust several years ago, a trust he instructed me not to disclose until you had been managing the farm on your own for at least 6 months. He pulled out a thick, bound document and a series of rolled-up maps. He knew there would be outside pressures after he was gone. He wanted to make sure you had a chance to connect with the land, to understand what it meant before you understood what it was worth." Robert let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Worth? Harrison, the place is bankrupt. John was a good man, but he was a terrible businessman. What's in the trust? A few sentimental heirlooms?" Mr. Harrison didn't smile. He slowly unrolled the first map on the coffee table. It was a topographical survey of our farm and the surrounding area. It was covered in complex lines, graphs, and notations. "About 5 years ago," Mr. Harrison said, his voice steady and clear, "your father leased minimal mineral rights to a geological survey company. It was all very quiet. He used the small proceeds to pay for a comprehensive private analysis of his own. These are the results." He pointed to a large shaded area on the map that sat directly beneath our farm. "Your father, Robert, wasn't a terrible businessman. He was a patient one. He was sitting on a secret. This farm, this bankrupt piece of land, is located directly on top of the largest, most accessible pocket of the Marcellus Shale Natural Gas Reserve in this state. The room went completely, utterly silent. The only sound was the faint buzzing of a fly against a windowpane. Mr. Harrison looked from the map to me, his eyes soft with a mixture of sympathy and pride. The land isn't worth a few $100,000, Chloe. According to these projections, it's worth billions. The word billions hung in the air, seeming to warp the very reality of the room. It was an impossible, fantastical number, something from a movie, not something that could apply to our dusty, debt-ridden farm. I stared at the map, at the shaded region that represented a fortune I couldn't comprehend, and felt a wave of dizziness. Josh was the first to break the silence, a choked, incredulous laugh escaping his lips. Billions? With a B? You've got to be kidding me, for this dirt pile? I assure you, I am not kidding, Mr. Harrison said, his voice unwavering. He unrolled another document. This is the full report from the geological surveyors, along with independent appraisals your father commissioned. The estimates vary, but even the most conservative one puts the value of the mineral rights alone at just over $2 billion. He turned a page. Furthermore, your father was a shrewd negotiator. The trust he established is ironclad. It names you, Chloe, as the sole beneficiary and executor. He structured it specifically to prevent the land from being sold off in pieces or swindled by predatory offers. He glanced meaningfully at my uncle. Robert's face had gone pale, a sickly white that stood out against his summer tan. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle jumped in his cheek. "This is absurd," he hissed, his voice strained. "John never said a word about this. He was broke. He borrowed money from me." "Yes, he did," Mr. Harrison confirmed calmly. He wanted to maintain the appearance of financial distress. He knew that if word ever got out about the potential value of this land, he'd be surrounded by sharks. He wanted to see who would show their true colors when they thought his daughter was vulnerable. The lawyer's gaze settled on Robert, cold and accusatory. My mind was reeling, trying to piece everything together. My father's secrecy, his stubborn refusal to sell, the strange meetings. It all clicked into place. He hadn't been sentimental, he'd been strategic. He had been playing the long game, protecting a legacy far greater than I had ever imagined. And he had been testing his own family. A test my uncle had just failed spectacularly. Tiffany was staring at me, her mouth agape, her phone forgotten in her lap. The bored, sarcastic girl was gone, replaced by someone looking at me as if for the first time. Brenda's face was a storm of conflicting emotions, disbelief, envy, and a dawning, horrified understanding. "So, all this time," she stammered, looking at the worn floorboards as if she could see the treasure beneath them. "All this time," Mr. Sutz, Harrison affirmed, "your brother was securing his daughter's future, ensuring she would never have to depend on the generosity of others." I finally found my voice, though it came out as a whisper. "He knew. All this time, he knew we were struggling, and he never said anything?" The question was laced with a pang of old hurt, of remembering my mother cutting coupons at the kitchen table while my father sat quietly on a king's ransom. Mr. Harrison's expression softened. "He knew it was a dangerous game, Chloe. The moment that knowledge became public, your lives would have changed forever, and not necessarily for the better. He was waiting for the right time, and he was setting a trap. Which brings us to another matter." He pulled a final folder from his briefcase. "Mr. Thompson, the developer my client Robert here is so fond of." Robert flinched at the name. "I did some digging after you called me this afternoon, Chloe," Mr. Harrison said. I shot him a look of confusion. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible wink. He was giving me an out, a way to explain my sudden defiance. "It turns out Thompson Development has a parent company, a holding corporation called Northridge Investments, and the majority shareholder of Northridge Investments." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the tension build until it was almost unbearable. "Is Robert Miller." The revelation landed like a physical blow. Brenda gasped and put a hand to her chest. Josh and Tiffany stared at their father, their expressions turning from shock to horror. It wasn't just a lowball offer from a business associate. It was a conspiracy. My own uncle, my father's brother, had created a shell corporation to try and swindle me out of my inheritance. He had used my grief and my financial desperation as leverage to try and steal a multi-billion-dollar asset for a paltry $200,000. "He wasn't doing you a favor, Chloe," Mr. Harrison said, his voice laced with quiet fury. "He was trying to defraud you. He was using his position of trust as a family member to commit grand larceny against his own niece." I looked at Robert, truly looked at him. The mask of the successful, concerned uncle was gone. In its place was the face of a cornered rat, pale, sweating, his eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape that didn't exist. The weight of his betrayal was staggering, a cold, heavy thing that settled in my chest. Weight of his betrayal, but underneath it, a new feeling was rising. The unshakable strength of a woman who finally understood her own power. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and suffocating. All eyes were on Uncle Robert. His carefully constructed world, the image of the successful patriarch, the savvy businessman, the concerned relative, had been demolished in a matter of minutes. He finally broke the silence, his voice a desperate, cracking imitation of his usual confident tone. "This is a misunderstanding, a clerical error. My name being on that holding company. It's a complex business structure. You wouldn't understand." "Oh, I think I understand perfectly," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. I stood up and walked to the coffee table, placing my hands flat on the survey map. My land. My future. You saw my parents die. You saw me grieving, struggling, and you didn't see a niece who needed help. You saw an opportunity. You saw a gullible, emotional woman you could easily manipulate. I picked up the crumpled offer from his company and held it up between my thumb and forefinger as if it were a piece of trash. "This lifeline you offered me? This was your weapon. You leveraged our family's trust, my father's memory, to try and steal from me." Brenda, finally finding her voice, turned on her husband. "Robert, is this true? You told me you were helping her." Her voice was shrill with panic. The foundation of her lavish life was crumbling before her eyes. "Stay out of this, Brenda," he snarled, his composure finally shattering. He turned back to me, his eyes wild with desperation. "Chloe, listen to me. We can still make a deal. A better deal. 50-50. We keep it in the family. Think of what we could build." The audacity of his offer, even now, was breathtaking. He wasn't sorry for what he did. He was only sorry he got caught. "A deal?" I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that held no humor. "There is no deal, Robert. There is no we. There is only me, the daughter of the man you tried to cheat, and you, a common thief dressed in a polo shirt." Harrison cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I should probably mention," he said, his tone casual, but his words carrying immense weight, "that what Robert has done here constitutes several felonies. Conspiracy to commit fraud, for starters. Attempted wire fraud if any of these offers were communicated electronically. Given the sums involved, he'd be looking at a significant prison sentence, not to mention complete financial ruin once the civil suits are filed." Josh, who had been frozen in place, finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "Dad?" Robert ignored his son. He took a step toward me, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Chloe, please. Think of the family. Think of the scandal. We can handle this quietly. No one needs to know." "You didn't think of the family when you were plotting to leave me with nothing," I shot back, taking a step forward to meet his advance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't intimidated by him. I saw him for what he was. A hollow man. A bully whose only power came from money and intimidation. "You didn't think of the scandal when you were lying to my face in my own home, just hours after I told you I was struggling to keep the lights on." I looked past him to his family. Brenda was weeping silently into her hands. Tiffany looked utterly lost, her curated world of superficiality providing no defense against this raw, ugly reality. Josh was staring at his father with a look of dawning contempt. "You," I said, my voice dropping to a low, intense level that commanded the room. You are going to leave this house. You are going to get in your shiny, expensive car, and you are going to drive off my property. And if I ever see you or hear from you again, I will personally hand-deliver Mr. Harrison's entire file to the district attorney. Robert's face contorted in a mask of pure fury. District attorney. The desperation was gone, replaced by the ugly rage of a tyrant who had been deposed. You'll regret this, he seethed. You have no idea how to handle this kind of money. You'll be lost. You need me. The only thing I need, I said, pointing toward the door, is for you to get out of my sight. He stood there for a moment, his chest heaving, a silent battle raging in his eyes. But he saw no weakness in mine, only absolute conviction. Defeated, he turned on his heel and strode toward the door, without a word to his family. Brenda, after a moment's hesitation, scrambled to her feet and followed him, her sobs trailing behind her. Josh and Tiffany remained, looking like shipwreck survivors. Josh finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a shame that was profound and real. I'm sorry, Chloe, he mumbled. I had no idea. What I said earlier, it was horrible. I'm so sorry. I just nodded, too emotionally drained for anger or forgiveness. They were victims of their father's greed as much as I was. They stood, and in a daze, followed their parents out into the night. I stood in the doorway and watched the red taillights of the Mercedes disappear down the long gravel driveway. The sound of its engine faded, leaving behind the familiar, peaceful chorus of the crickets. The air, which had been so heavy and toxic, suddenly felt clean again. I was alone, but for the first time in months, I wasn't lonely. I was the guardian of my father's legacy, and the fight had just begun. In the weeks that followed, the dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively. The story of Robert's attempted swindle and my newfound fortune didn't explode into a public scandal. Mr. Harrison handled it with quiet, ruthless efficiency. He met with Robert's lawyers, presenting them with the undeniable evidence of fraud. The message was clear: disappear or face total annihilation. The punishment was not a public shaming, but a quiet dismantling of a life built on deceit. Robert was forced to dissolve Northridge Investments and several other shell corporations, the process exposing his decades of shady dealings to his partners and investors. He lost his business, his reputation, and, from what I heard, the respect of his own children. Josh left the family firm and moved out west, wanting nothing more to do with his father. Brenda stayed with him, but their life in the gated community became a gilded cage of isolation. They weren't in jail, but they were living a life sentence of their own making, stripped of the power and prestige they valued above all else. Justice, I learned, didn't always come with a gavel. Sometimes it was the silent, inevitable collapse of a rotten foundation. My life, on the other hand, was transformed. The first thing I did was pay off every debt my parents had incurred, every predatory loan Robert had arranged. I wrote a check to the bank, saving the farm from foreclosure, the pen shaking slightly in my hand. With that single act, a weight I hadn't even realized I was carrying lifted from my shoulders. Mr. Harrison helped me assemble a team of financial advisors, energy consultants, and environmental experts. They were good people, recommended for their integrity as much as their skill. We didn't rush to sign a deal with the first energy company that came knocking, their helicopters suddenly circling my property like dragonflies. Instead, we planned. We structured a deal that focused on responsible extraction, with strict environmental protections, and a massive reinvestment into the local community. I established the Miller Family Foundation, a charitable trust dedicated to supporting local farmers, funding agricultural scholarships, and providing aid to families facing foreclosure. My father's secret wasn't just about money, it was about security. I wanted to use that security to help others, to give them the peace of mind my parents had fought so hard to find. I never went back to Chicago. Chloe, the marketing strategist, was a ghost from another life. I was Chloe, the landowner, the philanthropist, the daughter who had honored her father's legacy. I stayed in the farmhouse, though I had the roof fixed and the walls repainted. I I kept the old oak table my great-grandfather had built, the heart of the home. One crisp autumn afternoon, I found myself standing on the same grassy knoll where I had wept in despair just a few months earlier. The cornfields had been harvested. The land was resting, preparing for the winter. In the distance, a survey team was taking preliminary measurements for the new community center the foundation was funding. The land was no longer just dirt to me. It was a story, a responsibility, a future. My father had left me more than just wealth. He had left me a purpose. He had trusted me to not just protect the land, but to use its gifts wisely. A gentle breeze rustled the dry leaves in the trees, and for a moment, it sounded like my father's quiet, rumbling laugh. I smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. The dust of the farm was still on my boots, still in the lines of my hands, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that I was finally, truly home.